This has been called Newfoundland currency. For hundreds of years, dried salted codfish was virtually the only medium of exchange used by most people living in Newfoundland. By trading in kind, or by operating on credit from a small merchant, promising him the summer's catch, most resident fishermen could get the few necessities of life that they couldn't find or make for themselves: flour, cloth, gunpowder, ironware, line, perhaps molasses and rum. Before there was a resident population, there was very little need for any medium of exchange in Newfoundland because there was almost nothing to buy here. Ships' crews brought all they needed for the summer with them and weren't paid until they returned to their home ports with their catch in the fall. But as the resident population grew, money sometimes became a useful thing to have. By the late 1700s, the money passing here in St. John's might have been Spanish, Portuguese, French, or more likely British coins, and perhaps some paper money too. Large purchases could be made with bills of exchange, privately issued notes that worked almost like checks do today, except that they sometimes circulated too. In 1833, Newfoundland's first elected legislature met for the first time, and it wasn't long before they decided to do something for the finances of the residents. In June of 1834, a bill was passed creating the first local bank, the Newfoundland Savings Bank. Designed for the use of the general public, the smallest deposit you could make was a shilling, and the largest was only 50 pounds. The new bank was an immediate success, and when this colonial building, home of the legislature, was completed in 1850, the bank took up residence here.
Yeah, the savings bank opened for business in 1834. They had some small bills of exchange really then, but no actual bank notes. They didn't come about until 1850, when their island of Newfoundland banknotes denomination of £1 was introduced. There were other notes authorized up to £50, but they were never issued. And the £1 ones are the only known notes of that particular period. And they didn't last very long because they were ruled against by the British government when they got wind of the word that the Newfoundland government was issuing its own banknotes, which was against regulations. So they were ruled out of order and withdrawn from circulation. They didn't come any more notes from the Newfoundland Savings Bank until the 1920 issue of $1 and $2 notes came out in 1920. What happened was then the first commercial bank established here in about 1837, somewhere around there. The Bank of British North America came here and formed a branch of a commercial bank. And of course that really took the business away from the Newfoundland Savings Bank, and larger amount denominational notes became into use. And that continued up until about 1845, thereabouts, when the Union Bank came into being owing to the great dissatisfaction of service that was rendered by the Bank of British North America, and the local merchants formed this Union Bank of Newfoundland, and that became the first issue of local banknotes.
The commercial banks all issued their own currency, banknotes worth a specified amount of money in British pounds, and this circulated as currency does today. Behind the notes they issued stood the subscribed capital of the bank, money invested in it, outstanding loans, deposits of their customers. And the banks could also compete with each other, as the Bank of British North America found out when the Union Bank was founded. But their depositors weren't the only people the banks served. The large merchants needed local banks and bankers too.
These banks supplied or provided credit for the merchant to carry on his business in the fishery, was the mainstay of it. And of course, one bank could only satisfy a certain number of merchants. And these were mostly the shareholders of that particular bank, and they didn't look very favorable of lending to people who weren't their customers and so on. So with the profits they were making on their loans and exchange and so on, a certain outside group got left out in the cold, and they figured that they should form their own bank to get the same kind of services the Bank of Union Bank of Newfoundland was rendering to its shareholders and so on. So another group of merchants got together and formed the Commercial Bank of Newfoundland. That was founded in 1857. Both banks thrived and did a very prosperous business, with the Union Bank being the predominant one, they with about 2/3 of the business of the island, and the Commercial Bank with holdings of about 1/3 of the business of the island.
The Newfoundland legislature had allowed a number of issues of treasury notes in its early years, promissory notes worth so many pounds in British currency. But by the 1840s, the British government was disallowing these issues. By the late 1850s, these notes had been recalled and collected, leaving the Newfoundland government with no notes of its own. But in January 1865, the legislature introduced its own coinage in dollars and cents, in denominations ranging from 1-cent coins to $2 gold pieces. With decimal coinage and banknotes issued in pounds, things no doubt got more than a little confusing. But in 1877, the legislature ordered that all government accounts be kept in dollars and cents. The commercial banks then even began to issue notes with the values shown in both dollars and pounds. By the mid-1880s, though, all Newfoundland notes were in dollars. In addition to the coins and banknotes, a whole ransom of tokens were passing, and had been for some time, as a virtual currency. First used in St. John's and Harbor Grace in the 1840s, these were issued by merchants and given in change because of a shortage of coins. They could later be redeemed in goods, or as often happened, circulated as ready money, at least for a while. The tokens had a kind of double value for the merchants who issued them, because they not only served as a convenient source of coinage and change, but eventually had to be redeemed at the issuing merchants for more of his goods.
Well, paper, of course, didn't stand up to much wear, so the tokens for small change were a much better convenient type of coin to use. And they became quite numerous within a few years, and a great number of these tokens were from the mainland. Nova Scotian tokens became quite common. And just about anything at all was considered a token with a value of roughly around a cent or a penny. And even they were in such short supply that brass buttons were even recognized as a token. I think they were just acceptable by all means in the trade for small amount of money, and I don't think there was much risk involved. Of course, some preference. They came so common and so such a nuisance that they were actually outlawed some years later and brought to an end here. Official coinage replaced them.
In December 1894, something happened to change Newfoundland currency and banking practices forever. On the 10th of the month, Black Monday as it came to be called, the commercial and then the Union Bank failed. This was the result of a number of factors, several poor fishing seasons in a row and political upheaval, combined with a disastrous overextension of credit to its merchant customers. When English banks demanded payment for the notes they held, the commercial bank in turn demanded repayment from its customers. That set off a panic or run on the bank, with depositors and creditors also demanding their money. There just wasn't enough to go around, and the panic spread to the Union and savings banks. Only the Newfoundland Savings Bank survived, mainly because it was able to withdraw money owed it by the Union Bank. Not only did the banks crash, but business firms that were in debt to the banks were forced to stop operating. Some never did reopen.
It was a tremendous blow. I mean, people lost, case of Union Bank, 20 cents to the dollar, but the people holders of commercial bank lost their 80% to the dollar, 80 cents to the dollar. And it was a period of poor fishery, too. So it was hard times and the loss of their money, and of course the business firm. Everything was chaos.
Because the bank's currency failed too, everyone who had any Newfoundland paper money was affected. Not only those who'd had money deposited in the two banks. There just wasn't enough money to back up the notes they issued. Every Union or commercial banknote held by anyone from Ungava to St. Mary's Bay was temporarily worthless. When the dust settled, the commercial banknotes were only worth a fifth of their original value, and hundreds of people who'd worked for bankrupt firms were out of work. If it hadn't been for the arrival of the Canadian Bank of Nova Scotia a few days after the crash, there would have been virtually no paper currency on the island.
First to arrive was the Bank of Nova Scotia, just a few days afterwards. And from then on, of course, it's been an ever-broadening pattern of bank establishments. But these two local banks, one of them should never have crashed, I don't think. Some say that neither of them should have ever crashed. But Newfoundlanders got over it pretty quickly. And within a couple of years, the fishery came back to life again, good fishery results for the years, and this influx of new money, and the Canadian banks here. So really, it didn't last too long. At the final wind-up of the accounts some years later, the government originally, of course, guaranteed all these notes to a certain value. In the case of the Union Bank, they guaranteed 80 cents to the dollar. And in the commercial bank, they guaranteed 20 cents to the dollar. You brought your note there and you got it canceled. A $10 note, say, was worth $8 in the case of the Union and $2 in case of the commercial bank. Now, during the wind-up of the bank, certain dividends were payable over the years. And when you originally had your note revalued, they gave you a receipt saying that you had turned in so much Union Bank or commercial bank currency, and this receipt was held. And at various times over the next 10 years, dividends were paid in addition to the original 80 cents, so that the Union Bank usually paid off 91 cents to the dollar. The commercial bank never did so well. They only paid off an additional 2% for a total 22% to the dollar. But that's considered a pretty high payoff for a defunct bank.
After the crash, there wasn't much sound money around. The government-issued coins were still as good as ever, but all the Newfoundland paper money was affected because the one bank that didn't crash, the Newfoundland Savings Bank, didn't issue any notes. What came next to Newfoundland were Canadian banks with their own issues in Canadian dollars. Confidence in any bank took a while to build, but eventually banks like the Bank of Montreal took the former place of the Union and commercial banks. So on Water Street, more than 50 years before Confederation, you could earn, spend, and deposit your wages, all in the currency of the foreign Dominion of Canada. But the Newfoundland government needed some means of convenient exchange for its payments to people employed by the Department of Public Works, building and repairing roads, bridges, and other projects. The solution was to issue government cash notes, notes which passed like money but weren't quite money.
We used to pay the road workers or send out the foreman a bundle of money each payday, a package of silver coin to pay the workmen on the roads or project, whatever the case may be, his week's wages. Well, there's some doubt about the safe arrival of so much delivery of silver coin. Some of it seemed to disappear, and it was a great inconvenience and so on of the foreman having to look after it, that notes were issued, known as the black and white cash notes. Now, a book full of these, if you contracted to build a bridge, say, for $1,000 or some road work, the government would give you over the period of construction time $1,000 worth of this black and white cash notes. And of course, you would pay your men from by means of these cash notes. They were pretty secure because there were 3 signatures on these notes, and they didn't get the final signature of the foreman until he actually paid his worker for that amount of labor required. So the lack of security was no hold-up in being able to safeguard this money. So they were very, very useful for that purpose. So useful, in fact, that after about 3 or 4 years, the government decided that they were going to use it for other works other than road building, and they widened their scope to for use for payment of wages and so on, for poor relief, road work, and dockyard facilities, marine works, right? So they were easy to distribute, and they came out in color, as we call them, the colored notes. They came out in a color, and there's a set of 5 of them: $25, $50, $1, $2, and $5. Whilst the black and white cash notes were related to the hourly wages or a day's pay of $40, $80, $1, $2, and $5 notes, you see. Well, they were guaranteed by the Newfoundland government, but the Bank of Montreal were the agents, and they collected them. They passed as currency and used in the smaller shops and so on, and general currency by the holder until they reached the Bank of Montreal, and then they were taken out of circulation and charged to the exchequer account of the Newfoundland government. So the total issue for each year was voted by Parliament, and they could use up to a certain amount, you see.
Only in 1920 did the Newfoundland government actually issue paper money for general circulation. Though they were only in $1 and $2 denominations, they were genuine Newfoundland currency.
Well, that was the last issue by the Newfoundland government. They came out as a note issue following the cash notes that we just spoke about. And they were, of course, for general use. They were the note issue of Newfoundland, reserved to the Newfoundland government for $1 and $2 denominations. Anything above that was the right of the banks, Canadian banks here in St. John's. They had the right to issue all notes over and above $2. But the Newfoundland government at the same time had the right for $1 and $2 denominations, low currency values. 1937, all Canadian banks were taken out of, banknotes were taken out of circulation, and the Bank of Canada were the sole issuer of notes. But of course, the Newfoundland notes disappeared in 1939, and the Newfoundland private banknotes, of course, disappeared in 1894 with the bank crash.
From then until Confederation with Canada in 1949, only Newfoundland coins circulated as a distinctive national currency. When, on the morning of April the 1st in 49, Newfoundlanders began their daily commerce for the first time as Canadians, there was at least no change in currency to adjust to. 1949 marked the end of the history of Newfoundland currency, but this history still lives in Mr. Rowe's private collection of coins and paper money. He has written on the subject, has exhibited internationally, and his collection has won him many awards.
Now, the banknote collection contains a few interesting items. One is one of the earliest pieces of paper script issued by a local merchant here, and researched by a renowned paper money collector who specializes collecting banknotes with portraits of women on them. He's gone back to Japanese and Chinese money 3,000 years ago and made an intensive search. But the earliest note he can find is this one of Newfoundland merchant, about 1813, and that's the first banknote with a piece of paper money with a woman's portrait on it. Right? So there's another note, like a merchant in Placentia. He, of course, was here during the French occupation of Placentia, and notes were under the firm name. And during the 1800s, up until about the end of the war of 1812, people were not discouraged from settling on the land. Their total occupation, according to the English authorities, or British merchants out here, was that they were here for the sole purpose of the fishery and not cultivation of the soil. So it was illegal to build a house or conduct any agricultural program. But after the American Civil War, and Newfoundland had become more or less a home for fishermen, because they were really driven from the seas during that period of years, and they did settle in larger numbers, but it was finally granted them leave to cultivate the land. So this merchant came up with the idea that he would issue a new bill of exchange or scrip money with a fisherman's dory on it, with 3 fishermen, I think, jigging fish over the side of the boat as representing the fishing industry. And then just beneath him is a group of 3 trees indicating the privilege of being a planter in Newfoundland. So it's the fisherman planter note of Saunders, Sweetman, and Saunders, 1818. The only banknote with a Newfoundlander on it was Smith, the manager of the Union Bank in Newfoundland. He's centered right in the center of the $2 note. And then again, the Newfoundland dog is a familiar sight on them. And industrial work like mining on that $2 note and $1 note in 1920 is a lovely scene of mining activity. So I think just the study of the notes themselves for their intrinsic value as far as industrial development of fishery is concerned is well brought out on many of the notes.
Codfish, credit, foreign coins, tokens, and a hodgepodge of banknotes. Through disallowed currency, depressions, and bank crashes, the story of what passed in Newfoundland as money reflects a good deal of the commercial, economic, and even the social history of Newfoundland and Labrador. Some of the problems can be attributed to the very small and scattered population, or were caused by the limited economic base of the colony, and by a financial instability, often tied to the capricious price of fish, that resulted in a lack of confidence by other nations. In most outports, the kind of money in circulation was never of great importance, because there it was never plentiful, or even terribly necessary. And with the financial goings-on in St. John's, it's no wonder that sometimes, when hard currency did find its way to a cove or harbor, it was simply tucked away in an old sock or mattress and virtually forgotten.